This episode is sponsored by Squarespace. Squarespace makes it easy to create a beautiful website.
1960 was an eventful year in world history. It was in 1960 that the first weather and communication satellites were launched. John Kennedy was elected in 1960. 17 African nations achieved independence in 1960, but it was also the middle of the Cold War. But one little remembered event of that year made waves and actually prompted Nikita Khrushchev to say thank you to the United States. In January of 1960, a Soviet self propelled barge broke loose from its moorings and sent its four occupants off floating into the middle of the Pacific Ocean with 3 days' worth of food. It is a chilling story of the coldest days of the Cold War that, in the end, might warm your heart, and history that deserves to be remembered. I've talked to you about Squarespace before. That's the all in one website platform. And thank you, Squarespace, for sponsoring another episode of the History Guy. But the thing is, I really think this is a great platform, whether it's for your business or for your hobbies or for maybe an online resume or just to establish your own personal brand. Squarespace gives you the tools to build a professional looking website that is uniquely yours without having to pay a professional. It uses design intelligence, which leverages their 2 decades of industry-leading design experience to build a website that really is uniquely you. And it's easy to do, it's intuitive, and it's a whole lot of fun. And then once you do that, you can have whatever pieces that you need to make this the website that you want, whether you want to take in donations or to sell things or to schedule appointments or to do email campaigns. Let's say you have a blog. Lots of people have a blog, right? Well, Squarespace helps you make a successful blog. It helps you create blog posts that are visually appealing. It helps you organize those and make them searchable by keywords. It helps you to even push those out to social media. It manages things like comments and excerpts and drafts, everything you need to build a great blog. Or maybe you want to make money off your digital content. Squarespace allows you to build gated member areas so that you can sell your gated content and then seamlessly connect your public content to your private content and earn passive income. There's just so much that a good website can do for you, and Squarespace can give you that good website. So go to squarespace.com and try your free trial. And when you're ready, go to squarespace.com/thehistoryguy and get 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain by using the code thehistoryguy.
The 1960s were some of the most intense between the United States and the Soviet Union, with incidents such as the 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1960, a U-2 spy plane was shot down over the Soviet Union, and nuclear missiles were stationed in Italy within range of Moscow. More than 40,000 American soldiers were stationed in Japan that year, as the country served as a primary bulwark against Soviet and Red Chinese influence in the region. In 1945, the island of Iturup, the northernmost of the southern Kuril Islands, was occupied by the Soviet Union. Japan maintained a claim to the island, which it still considers to be the northernmost island in the country. Although the Soviet Union and Japan established diplomatic relations in 1956, Soviet occupation of the island, among others, prevented any formal peace treaty. The Soviets expelled all of the island's Japanese inhabitants and established a military presence on the island. Among its functions was a supply base for Soviet ships. Because good moorings for large ships is difficult, the Russians used self-propelled barges to carry supplies offshore and deliver them to waiting Russian warships. The men that served on them were part of the island garrison, and so were soldiers, not sailors. The self-propelled barges were small landing craft, somewhat similar to but smaller than the American Higgins boat. 17 feet long at the waterline, the around 100 gross ton vessels were powered by two 300 horsepower diesel engines, capable of making around 9 knots. The small ships were meant for near-shore use. They were not meant to sail in the open ocean. In the early days of January 1960, all 6 of Iturup's barges were pulled ashore for repairs. The ships were to remain ashore to wait out the rougher weather of the winter, when it was too dangerous to operate these small barges. As was routine during repairs, the ship's usual 10-day supply of emergency rations was taken off the ship. However, shortly afterward, the leadership was informed of a late-arriving supply ship, carrying, according to one of the survivors, a refrigerator with meat. 2 of the barges, the T-36 and the T-97, were put back to sea. The normal crew of the T-36 was 5. However, the radio operator had injured his leg during mooring and was sent to the hospital, leaving 4 men aboard the barge as it left shore on January 16th. Each of the ships was given a 3-day supply of food and 1.5 tons of fuel. Aboard were 21-year-old Tatar Junior Sergeant Ashkat Zinganshin, often called Victor. Two Ukrainians, Privates Philip Pavlovsky and Anatoly Khrushchevsky, both 20 years old, and Private Ian Fedotov, a 22-year-old Russian. The two barges moored to a floating barrel about 500 feet offshore to wait for the supply ship's arrival. According to Khrushchevsky, usually they got enough warning about a storm to beach the small boats, but this time the hurricane came as a complete surprise to us. It was after midnight when the storm struck, quickly turning the ocean into a frothing mess. The waves were so strong that they broke the cables with which the barges were connected to each other and to the bank, and we immediately lost sight of the T-97. The T-97 drifted back to shore. The four men were immediately in dire straits. They had a compass, but it was out of order, and visibility was nil. According to the American Fleet Weather Central, the storm caused 50 to 70 knot winds and 30 to 40-foot seas. Doing their best to estimate their position, they used the diesel engine to keep the barge in the bay while the waves towered around them. Initially, they tried to keep themselves away from the shore, but as fuel ran out and the storm continued to rage, Ashcott, the ranking commander, tried to turn the barge into the shore, hoping to run it aground. They hit a rock called Devil's Hill, and water began to fill the engine room. At that point, the wind was pulling them away from the shore instead of toward it, and despite running the engines at full power, they were unable to make much headway. Ashcott remembers actually feeling the ship touch the ground as they desperately charged the shore. When the engines died, the small boat was carried out of the bay and into the open ocean. For several days, the men kept up their spirits, believing that rescue would soon come, even as the sea remained restless. There was no panic among us, Anatoly recalled. The situation was not ideal. Much of their supply had been washed overboard or damaged during the storm, including the firewood for their small stove and the fresh water tank. Their radio was dead. They had very little food: 2 cans of stewed meat, a kilogram of cereal and peas, a little tea and coffee, some lard, and 2 buckets of potatoes. Ashkat recalls a loaf of bread. The potatoes, unfortunately, were stored in the engine room. They'd come loose in the storm, rolling in the water, and leaked diesel fuel. They had about 50 matches. Swimming was out of the question, and the ship's deck was icy, its anchor frozen. They attempted to maintain normalcy, making notes in the logbook and taking turns at watch. The entire time they're at sea, the ocean raged, as they call it, with only a handful of days of relative calm. Back on Iterup, the commanders began search and rescue, but all they could find were the remains of the firewood box and 1 life preserver washed ashore with T-36 on them. The most likely possibility seemed to be that the barge had sunk, taking the crew with it. Eventually, the base reported the men missing. On board, they found a copy of the Red Star newspaper, and reading it, Ashcott realized that part of the ocean that they were drifting into was being cordoned off for missile tests, meaning no ships were allowed to sail in the area. I began to suspect that they would not find us until the beginning of spring, Ashcott remembers, and so they almost immediately began rationing what supplies they had to last until at least March. But there simply wasn't enough food. As the days wore on, they ate once a day, and then once every 3, eventually quartering a single potato for an entire day's food. They'd resisted eating the gas-tainted potatoes, but after a few days, even the taste of diesel fuel was preferable to hunger. They fixed the hole in the ship and spent hours using a hand pump to remove water from the hold. The pump broke repeatedly. To cook and keep themselves warm, they had to burn anything and everything they could find. They burned what wood was left from crates, old newspapers, lifesavers, and rags, and even took planks from 2 of the beds. Finally, they turned to the tires that hung over the sides of the boat as bumpers, slicing off chunks of them with a dull kitchen knife. They smoked badly, but each of the 4 tires could keep the stove going for about a week. For water, they turned to the engine's cooling system, which held around 30 gallons, or over 120 liters of water that was red with dust and tasted like metal. The men also spread their sheets over the deck to collect rainwater that they could wring out, eventually gathering several glasses of it. 10 days into the journey, on January 27th, was Anatoly's 21st birthday. They cooked 2 potatoes that day in celebration and poured Anatoly a double ration of water, which he remembered as a luxurious gift in those conditions, but he refused it, insisting that birthday cake is eaten with guests, and divided the extra ration equally among the others. To keep up their spirits, they remembered other situations where men had survived adrift, including Alain Bombard, who had sailed solo across the Atlantic in 1952 with almost no supplies aboard a rubber boat. He had fish to feed himself for much of the journey. Fedotov remembered that in some parts of the journey, Bombard had actually been bombarded with flying fish, which had landed in his boat. "We dreamed of the same thing," Anatoly said, even imagining they heard the fish at the deck. In reality, when they tried fishing, between the cold water, the shaking boat, and the improvised fishing equipment, they caught nothing. Fedotov was the only one whose spirit seemed to have threatened to crack, at one point shouting that they were doomed. The others turned the conversation to safer avenues, especially food, which they all thought of constantly as hunger became even more pressing. By February 23rd, they had eaten all of their food. They turned to anything that could be potentially edible. It was Ashcott who recalled one of his teachers telling a story about sailors who had eaten part of mast when they were starving. First, they cut up a watch strap, boiled it, and drank the broth, swallowing the hard leather. There was a feeling that there was something in our stomachs, at least, the crew said. Anything leather came next: belts and boots, and even the sheepskin of an accordion. And Anatoly even recalls chewing on a broomstick made of bamboo shoot. For the boots, which would become the most famous part of the journey, they could eat only some parts, as much of the boot was made of tarpaulin, not leather. Frying the boot leather seemed to make it a little softer, and it helped when they coated the strips with a little grease. It couldn't keep them going for very long. Several times they spotted ships in the distance, but they were unable to attract their attention. They had sewn together blankets to make a kind of four-man sleeping bag to stay warm, and had discussed what they would do when they finally felt that they were going to die. They would say goodbye to each other and scratch their names into the barge, hoping that someday someone would find it. Toward the end, they remembered hallucinations and watching as sharks began circling the inert craft. While the four men were drifting, trying not to starve, American ships had been participating in SEATO, Southeast Asian Treaty Organization exercises, including the carrier USS Kearsarge. Kearsarge left Yokosuka, Japan on March 3, 1960, on her way back to California. On March 7th, the Kearsarge was surprised when they got a report in the afternoon from one of their S-2F trackers, anti-submarine aircraft, of an LCM, side number 36. It was sighted visually from the ship at 3:08 p.m., 4 crew visible. They launched helicopters, SH-3 Sea Kings, to identify and potentially rescue those aboard. According to Ashcott, the hardest part of the voyages was immediately after the American ship first approached. The men were too tired to come out of the ship and try to speak to the Americans, who in turn were waiting for someone to come and get them. For a moment, it seemed like the ship chose to abandon them, and they had lost their last chance at salvation. Soon, however, a helicopter appeared hovering over the ship, asking in broken Russian, "Do you need help?" Ashcott was the first to be brought aboard the helicopter. At first, they intended to negotiate to see if they could get some food and fuel and return to their base on their own power. They had no idea how far they had drifted. In 49 days, they had drifted over 1,000 miles and were then 1,200 miles north of Wake Island. There was no chance that they could sail the poor barge back to Asia. The Kearsarge attempted to tow the barge, but eventually gave up. According to Life magazine, they considered sinking the ship as it presented a navigation risk, but were hesitant to sink a Soviet vessel in peacetime. Hitching a ride with the Americans was not precisely where several young Soviet men wanted to be. It would be easier to die than to end up with the Americans, Ashcott said. They were tired, hungry, and wary, having grown up in the propaganda-heavy years of the Cold War. None of the men had ever dealt with foreigners before, and soon they were at a press conference, having pictures taken by 24 American journalists. They felt only a little better when a Pravda journalist assured them not to be afraid of anything, tell them everything as it is. Still, it felt like they were in enemy territory, even as they were treated well and fed. It took 8 more days for the carrier to finally reach San Francisco. Ashcott worried that the entire time that his commanders would be furious that they had left the barge behind. He even said he considered suicide. The event received considerable press coverage globally. Khrushchev said the rescue was an expression of the friendship that is developing between our countries. The 3 men were in rough shape. Each had lost around 30 kilograms, 66 pounds. Years later, they learned that Russian police had searched their homes after they reported missing, apparently suspicious that they had taken their chance to desert. In the U.S., they got treatment, and notably said that they saw televisions for the first time. There was a rush of events. The mayor of San Francisco gave them the keys to the city. They flew from New York and by boat across the Atlantic before flying to Moscow from Paris. They each were offered the chance to stay in the United States, but all chose to return to the USSR. In Russia, they became stars, almost as famous as cosmonauts. In their first speech, Zengashin said, "We did not consider our 49 days on a landing craft extraordinary feat, but merely part of our duty," and ascribed their survival to their communist upbringing. The Minister of Defense gave them navigator's watches so that they don't get lost again. Songs were written about them, such as the Zengashin Boogie, where they sing Zengashin ate his second boot. A Soviet movie, not particularly accurate, was released in 1963. They traveled all over and were hailed as heroes. They were awarded the Order of the Red Star and gave speeches on ships, at schools, and for the public.
All but Fedotov went on to attend naval school, and they all lived normal lives, mostly in the Navy. They were still recognized in the street, and for many years afterwards, people would gift them boots in memory of their experience, but as time passed, memories faded and they stopped being recognized on the street. Fedotov passed away in 2000, Pavlovsky in 2001, Zinganshin died in 2017, and as of February of 2025, Anatoly Khrushchevsky is the last survivor of the four. None of the four ever seemed to admit to being heroes. When pressed on the subject, Anatoly merely said, "What can I say? We were lucky." Do you see? You see the cat in the picture right there? You see? Right there. That's you. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community and locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop, book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.